ask the questions, but there's nothing in the code that specifically states for the first 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet. So just a bit of clarification on that. So continuing on, whenever we first hosted this, this was hosted over 2 days. So from here on out, we're not going to go in perfect order. We are going to hit all the sections, but what you'll find is we kind of jump around. And this is the byproduct of turning those 2 days into 1 day. So if you think, hold on, how'd they skip curb ramps? We're definitely going to get to curb ramps. We're just going to kind of jump around a little bit in this guidance from here on out. So first up on our list, I guess before we get started, any questions on anything else before we hop into the next thing? Not seeing any. On-street parking and passenger loading zone sort of connected to it. So passenger loading zone, the big definition on that is it's an area specifically designed or designated for loading and unloading passengers and does not primarily serve vehicles on a fixed or scheduled route. So this is the statement that basically pulls transit out of passenger loading zones. So this is the definition that makes transit stops its own thing, passenger loading zone, specifically for the loading and unloading of passengers, not related to buses. Parking-wise, the way Prowag looks at parking is on a block perimeter basis. So in this example here, it is the near sides of the street surrounding a block. So if we look at this block in the middle, it's the one side of Main Street, but the other side of Main Street falls under a different block perimeter. So whenever you start looking at your on-street parking, it's not, this is the block on both sides of Main Street that I'm looking at. It's the entirety of that block. And then that's how we count up our loads. So it's possible that we could have that metered parking on one side of our block, but if it's open residential parking for the other 3 sides, we only have to do counts for the parking that is applicable for us that we're counting for that area. So in this case, it's that south side of Duane Street, the east side of Forest Avenue, the north side of Hillside Avenue, and the west side of Main Street. So parking wise, everything's always thought on a block by block basis, not a street basis. Required spaces, we already talked about this a little bit, where on-street parking is provided. If anybody ever wants to have a conversation on what in the ADA requires on-street parking spaces, the answer is this: Fort Union versus the city of Lomita. So just threw that out there as sort of a, if you're ever interested in diving into the legal side of this, Fort Union versus the city of Lomita is really sort of where a lot of these accessible parking were, not the technical requirements, but the obligation to provide them really sort of started with this legal case. I know sometimes people are really interested in the legal cases and how we got here. Other times they're not. This is kind of an interesting one because it did go all the way through the system and is sort of the precedent that is used a lot of times for parking conversations. Parking wise, if you're ever doing on-street parking, Prowag does have its own accessible parking table. Very similar to the 2010 ADA standards, not exactly the same. So if you're ever doing on-street parking, make sure that you're looking at the parking table that is provided within the Prowag. 1 to 25 spaces, 1 spot, 26 to 50, 2 spots. I'm not really sure how you get to 201 parking spaces on a block, but if you do, at that point, it becomes 4% of the total. The important thing to remember with on-street parking is you have to provide that connection back to the sidewalk. That's really what we're trying to do with on-street parking. A lot of this is about placement of those on-street parking spaces. Are they placed in such a way that we are providing that accessible route to get to our sidewalk? So for parallel parking spaces, the curb ramp can be provided at either end of the parking space. There's a slide about this later on, but if that's the parking spot that's closest to the curb ramp can be, your intersection curb ramp can serve as your curb ramp for the parking space. So accessible parking spaces doesn't automatically mean that you need to provide more curb ramps within your block. If based on where you place them, you can utilize the curb ramps that already exist for the crosswalks as the arrival point for the parking spaces as well. For perpendicular or angled parking, the curb ramp provided connects to the access aisle to the pedestrian access route. So if you are going to provide a curb ramp within your perpendicular or angled parking, that goes in the access aisle for the parking spots. Yes, sir. So the question is, if you on a parallel parking spot and you provide a curb ramp, it doesn't need to have truncated domes. As long as that's not the crosswalk curb ramp, you're absolutely correct. Yes. Yeah. So if you're providing a parallel parking spot, and the same goes for the perpendicular and angled parking as well, if you're providing a dedicated curb ramp for that parking spot, you do not have to have truncated domes for that parking spot curb ramp. Yes.
Angled parking located next to the curb ramp function.
Yes. Oh, sorry, for the video. The question was for angled parking, I'll extend that to perpendicular parking as well. Can the curb ramp serve the function as the curb ramp for that parking spot? And the answer to that was yes.
So going back to the number of parking spaces required, we're looking at the whole block base then?
Correct.
How does that work? So there's the exemption for residential parking. How does that figure if, say, for example, an older neighborhood, it's exclusively residential, but we maybe have one commercial property within that block base? Do we then trigger the need for that many accessible spots around the entire block base? You know, we might need, say, 4 accessible spots for business, or kind of how does that work, I guess?
So the question is, in a situation where the majority of the block is residential, but there is, say, 1 or 2 commercial buildings within that block, sort of how does that work for the parking space count and the triggers for accessible parking? The way that I've always interpreted it is that it is, in that particular case, I would consider most of that residential and then provide 1 accessible spot near that business. I would not count the whole block. I would also say, don't put it on the other side of the block that's in a residential area and doesn't actually do any good for the commercial business. But I do not read this, the guidelines as you have to count the entire block because you have 1 commercial property within that block. Yes.
Not with this accessible parking, this is all just for you. We have parking currently, you don't have to go and retrofit it for accessible.
Correct. So if you are redoing the street, that'll be a trigger. To me, that is yes, that falls under the trigger because that's the same. Yeah, I got to do curb ramps and all that as well. So that would fall under that. Until you do something else. Yeah, I would also throw in that caveat of if you ever get a complaint about it, that's also a time in which it's worth looking into. But yeah, if you got a street that you don't plan on touching for 10 years, I think it's fair. And again, to me, this is where that ADA transition plan is so important. Is the answer is we're going to address this when we address the street or we get a complaint related to parking. Questions? Parallel parking spaces. So these numbers are going to seem shocking. This is all about the exemption. So don't be stunned by the numbers. The way that Prowag reads is that parallel parking spaces shall be 24-foot long, 13-foot wide, which sounds outrageous, right? So This is where we go to the exemption. So where parallel parking spaces are altered, but the adjacent sidewalk is not, the spaces can match the dimensions of the adjacent spaces. So if provided, nearest the crosswalk and a curb ramp is provided. So if all your other spaces are 8 foot wide, that space can be 8 foot wide. Also on there, in alterations, providing the dimensions shown above would result in an available right-of-way less than or equal to 9 feet measured from the curb line to the right-of-way line. You could also go back to matching the existing spaces. So from a math perspective, kind of the way to think about this is if you have less than a 14-foot wide sidewalk, you can provide the 8-foot wide parking space. If you have, say, a 20-foot wide sidewalk, they want you to provide that 5-foot cut in for the accessible parking space. So unless you have a super, super wide sidewalk, you're basically going to use these exemptions to not have to provide the 13-foot wide parking spot. So picture here, for those of you in the back, this is what I would call a standard downtown area, marked parallel parking on both sides of the street. Without getting into the questions of complete reconstruction or key locations, does anybody have any opinions on sort of where they would start looking at placing these accessible parking spots? Near the intersections. That's my advice to you of the easiest way to do this. Always start near the intersections. If it works, it's the best possible place to put them. So in this case, we got 2 spots on the top, 2 spots on the bottom. I am not saying that you have to make both those spots accessible parking. To me, those are the 2 spots to start. I would also add, if you're flat on one side and it's like a 9% road grade on the other side, be thoughtful as to where you put those spaces. Place them in the flattest spot possible location. Again, think about the usability, think about the end user, and think about how this is going to be used. So parallel parking spaces, at the end of the day, they're fairly straightforward. If you got less than 14-foot wide sidewalk, they can be that 8-foot wide. They can go at the ends. You can use the curb ramps. The 50%, even though you're using the curb ramp as your access point, that 50% clear center requirement still exists for this, because that's serving 2 completely different groups of people. The curb ramp is about someone who drives and uses a mobility device to get up to the sidewalk. The 50% sidewalk clear zone is about the person who exits their mobility device on the passenger side. So providing one does not exempt you from providing the other, because those are 2 very distinct users who are going to be using either the curb ramp or the ramp out of the vehicle to get to the sidewalk. So we already talked about the 50%. Parking space shall be identified by signage. If you have an accessible parking space, you have to sign it as an accessible parking space. Also, if you just read R310, it says that the sign has to be mounted 60-inch minimum above the ground surface. If you have sidewalk directly behind the back of curb, that number goes up because you have to be out of basically you have to, I'm trying to think of the right word for this. Basically, it has to get over that 80 inches for hitting your head on it. So even though it says 60-inch minimum here, the Prowag is full of situations in which 60-inch minimum applies to the parking spot, but there might be other standards within here that require you to change that more. We'll have a deeper conversation about this whenever we get into signage, but just a friendly reminder, a lot of times whenever you read these, if you just stop at R310 and you put that sign in at 60 inches within the existing sidewalk, there's another part of the guidelines that you're not going to be meeting at that point. Does that? I think I think it makes sense in my head. I don't guarantee it makes sense in anybody else's head. So perpendicular parking spaces. 96-inch wide access aisle shall extend the full length of the parking space. So you got to have that 8-foot access aisle next to whatever that accessible space is. Where the access aisle serves only one parking space, the access aisle shall be located on the passenger side of the vehicle. So that is clearly defined in here. So in this case, this accessible parking spot up here, that access aisle is on the wrong side. That access aisle is on the passenger side because, again, this is about the side of the van and using the ramp to get out of the side of the van. So this is a question that has come up a couple times, but this is clearly defined within Prowag as to what side that access aisle is supposed to go on. Angled parking. The width of the angled parking shall be 132 inches with a 60-inch access aisle in this case. So the perpendicular parking was the 8-foot parking spot, 8-foot access aisle right next to it. For perpendicular parking, they want the 13-foot parking spot. Is my math right on that? No, 11-foot? 11-foot parking spot with the 5-foot access aisle next to it. So angled parking and perpendicular accessible parking do not have the same width requirements as each other. The reason I've always heard for this is because for perpendicular parking, there was too many cars who viewed that access aisle as a parking spot. So by going to 11 and 5, you are disincentivizing people from this parking in that 5-foot access aisle. Why that didn't pass on to perpendicular, I don't know. That's just the way the guidelines are set up as of now. So hopefully that answers your striping questions about dimensions for accessible parking. Is there any other specific questions that you had? Because I know you asked that question earlier. Yeah. So again, access aisles are still on that passenger side. So angled perpendicular parking, access aisle always goes on the passenger side. If you have two that are side by side, they can be shared. If you have two that are side by side, though, it is fair to ask that question of, are you providing coverage throughout the block if you need two accessible parking spaces? Is it best to put them right by each other, or are you better off to space them out across the entirety of the block? But if for your design, the best answer is to have two accessible spaces right by each other, they can still share that access aisle. This is specifically for those examples of typically on-street parking tends to be one accessible space, and then the other accessible space is located somewhere else on the block. So passenger loading zone. Oh. Let me read. I believe there's a specific exception about it. Let me read up on that, because I feel like there's something. Write that down, Nick. I'll figure out exactly where it's at. I'm almost positive there's something in there. Let me do a bit of homework. For better or for worse, my general ADA answer is give me a minute. I will also throw out, if you don't know the answer to a question, you are never wrong to say, give me a minute. If anybody ever asks you an accessibility question, whether it's out in the field, in the office, a council person, it's never wrong to say, I need to look that up. Because my second answer is always, well, here's the 11 different circumstances that can control what's accessible and what's not accessible. So I say it a lot. I encourage you guys to say it a lot. Take that time, to look into all the options so you can provide one good, clear answer at the end. So passenger loading wise, vehicle pull-up spaces shall be 96 inches wide by 20 feet long. This is where you do have to have that adjacent access aisle, and that needs to be at least 5 foot wide and the full length of the vehicle pull-up space. I think this is probably the big thing to note on passenger loading zones, because often they have the curbs that tuck into the sidewalk for those. That 20 foot is measured from where the radius stops on the one side to where the radius starts on the next side. That 5 foot has to extend the entire length of that adjacent access aisle. And even though you're providing that 5 foot space, that center 50% requirement still continues on for the passenger loading zones as well. We don't tend to see a lot of passenger loading zones. So if anybody has any specific questions about those, I'd be more than happy to answer them. We just tend to not spend a lot of time on them because a lot of communities just don't have them. So next up, we are going to jump back to R304 and dive into the always exciting world of curb ramps.
Getting into curb ramps now. And so we're going to start off with some definitions of what is a curb ramp. So a curb ramp, in a general sense, is a ramp that will take you from the street or crosswalk to a pedestrian access route. So to break it down further, it's a sloped connection that's cut through or built into a curb, up to a curb. Curb ramp being perpendicular or parallel to the street or curb that it serves, or combination therefore. So again, it's to take you from the street to your pedestrian access route, your accessible route that's in your pedestrian right of way. Then a crosswalk, that's the street part of your curb ramp, which is they both tie together, are part of a roadway that is located at the intersection or connections of pedestrian circulation paths. So a crosswalk is going to take you from pedestrian circulation path to pedestrian circulation path. That pedestrian circulation path has the curb ramp in it that connects you to the pedestrian access route, giving a lot of terms and a lot of definitions all combined within each other. But again, it's crosswalk to ramp to landing to pedestrian access route. Those all flow in together into one. Where we get confused is a curb ramp is not a ramp. So what is a ramp? A ramp is a change of grade within your pedestrian access route, pedestrian circulation path that is greater than 5%. It doesn't have to be part of the circulation path that follows the road grade, but any deviation of greater than 5% is needed to get access to pedestrian access route is now considered a ramp. Confused you yet? It confused me too. So an easier way to say it, if you have a ramp or a needed area outside of your pedestrian circulation path, that's your accessible routes, and you need to raise the grade above 5%. This is when you start getting into needs for handrails, needs for other landing spaces or clear width areas. So it can be part of the circulation path itself, but it can deviate away from your accessible route. But anytime you need to go above a 5% that your road grade doesn't match or veers off away from your accessible route is when you get into ramps. And I'll give some more photo examples so I'll get a little bit better idea of everything. Clear as mud? Everyone following me here? Good. Bring in the different types of ramps. So here first, we're gonna have a perpendicular curb ramp. Terminology can kind of get confusing, but it's the easiest way is just to break it down into two separate factors. It's the street and the curb and what direction you're coming into. So a perpendicular ramp is going to be perpendicular to your curb or your street. This could come in one singular perpendicular ramp could come in with two separate access routes. This is an example here. You can see I have my ramp and my running slope coming down. That's perpendicular to my curb and my street up to a landing. And then this is that transfer pad that we were talking about earlier, that if you're going to come and redo the rest of the sidewalk, you're going to eliminate that transfer pad. That eventually will break into your accessible landing area so you don't have to touch that. That's the idea built in with the transfer pads. So I think this is part of the pad right here. But again, perpendicular to street or curb. That's how you define what a perpendicular ramp would be, as compared to a parallel ramp, where it comes down onto a landing and it follows your curb or street line. You'll see this around large radius returns for streets that come into an island, for large highway crossings or anything like that. So the curb ramp with a running slope that's parallel to the curb or the street. You see that it comes down, there's two running slopes that you're gonna have involved with a parallel ramp, with a landing in the center of those that match up to the road grade. And then getting into everyone's favorites now, blended transitions. We're finding these everywhere we go now, because it accompanies a lot of different grades, all into one larger area. So we've had this photo as an example before, but we've defined it out a little easier for you to see where the landings, the running slopes are all coming in at. I have some diagrams coming up earlier, so you guys don't need to be doodling anything too crazy right now, but it'll get a little easier to see with these lined out. So you have two pedestrian access routes, two separate running slopes that are coming onto a graded landing area. They have two adjacent streets that are matching. So on top of all this, a blended transition will accompany two separate crosswalks. So the crosswalk itself embodies the entirety of the ramp. You see here, this isn't a good example of pavement markings by any means, but this pavement marking should go to the very end of where we have our truncated domes, all the way out to the other side of where that inlet would be. That's a way for anyone with a visual impairment to determine where they are going, and when they feel the roller or cane go over the top of that area, it's easy for them to determine if they're running over paint and then they hit just raw asphalt or concrete. They can feel that difference, so it gives them sort of a boundary of where they're supposed to go, swap back and forth. So when you go back and you redo curb ramps in general, you need to know that you're going to come back and redo pavement markings as well as the crosswalk itself to get from curb ramp to curb ramp. Diagonal ramps. So this seems to be everyone's immediate answer when they don't have a curb cut anywhere else, just go throw a diagonal. The only time they're called out in Prowag that you use a diagonal ramp is at an intersection where one ramp or blended transition isn't capable of being built because of existing utilities, or it's technically infeasible to be compliant if redoing, and this would send them straight into, say, a utility box, a light pole, anything like such. So you can see from the picture, we have our two streets. We wish they could have a blended transition, but dropping that down, you would be going into a terminal box, pedestrian light pole, and you would also be dropping the road grade from the side of the building. So the answer here would be put in diagonal. You will try to avoid diagonals at all costs. Just from suggestion, when you're using a ramp, for someone that's going to be coming down for, say, a wheelchair too, this direction you're impacting the road does matter. This 5% grade when you hit the street. So for someone that has a low foot grade, so if you only have a certain minimum threshold where they can hit, if they come down and it's too steep to hit onto that pavement right where the street matches, they'll be launched off of their wheelchair, potentially going straight forward into the street. So when you try to have these grades come out, so having two perpendicular ramps would be preferred here, but when it's incapable of having, you can do this diagonal ramp.
Yeah, I think sort of the default answer that you hear all the time is that the Prowag doesn't allow diagonal ramps. The answer isn't that Prowag doesn't allow diagonal ramps. The answer is you have to be prepared to justify why you're doing a diagonal ramp. There's going to be certain situations in which diagonal ramps are the only feasible option to get a curb ramp in there. But this is, to me, this is probably the strongest example for that maximum extent practicable form that we were talking about earlier. Document why you're doing what you're doing. Document, this is our design decisions. These are the obstacles that we can't get around. So therefore, we're putting this diagonal ramp in. Because the way you read, the way the Prowag reads is the expectation is to have one curb ramp for each crosswalk. A blended transition is considered one curb ramp for two crosswalks, but that's specifically allowed. And then these apex corners, diagonal ramps are allowed under this exception. So there are situations in which you're going to have to put these in. But please don't take us stating this exception as you can put them in all the time. These are the last chance, this is the last chance. We have no other options that we can possibly explore. So this is why we're choosing to put in this ramp. So I think there's times in which we're very willing to put in the diagonal ramps. There's times in which we say we can't put in the diagonal ramps. And the answer is you should do everything you can to not put them in, but at some point you just might not have a choice in what to do. The other big challenge with diagonal ramps, for those of you that might not know, on top of the wheelchairs is the blind community. If you imagine that you are blind and you're walking out at one of these apex corners, where are you walking to? You're walking into the middle of the street. The blind community is incredible at knowing how to navigate the public right of way. They figure it out. They are phenomenal at it. Our goal is not to make their lives harder than what it needs to be. So if you have to do it, by all means, one single diagonal ramp will always be better than providing no ramp. I just encourage you to do everything in your power to find an alternative solution before you go to the diagonal.
Any questions about that? Okay, we'll move on to non-crossing, crossing prohibited areas. So the picture itself is on Las Vegas Boulevard. This is an area of downtown, if anyone's ever visited or anything like that, or seen this. They have this large crossing over top of the highway, along with escalators, stairs, and an accessible elevator on the back side of it. So what they don't want is pedestrians to walk straight across Las Vegas Boulevard into traffic, because I'm sure everyone in Las Vegas is paying complete attention to the traffic while they're out there. But when a pedestrian crossing is prohibited, curb ramp or blend transition shall not be provided on the roadway. With that exception though, what they do require is a landscape or non-prepared surface, 24 inches minimum, the technical edge treatment at the bottom of 15 inches. So what this is stating that you're gonna have a hard curb, you're also going to have these barriers at the minimum of 24 inches. That's these bollards that are around here, along with this fenceway to deter any individual from coming across there. It's also deters anyone with a visual impairment to mistake that as a potential boundary from going out onto traffic, trying to find a way around that barrier. So this deters any foot traffic from coming anywhere near that area or traffic.
I will say that it doesn't have to necessarily be a fence. It could be a curb, it could be something like that, because as soon as you put in fence, you're now getting to clear zone issues, things of that nature. We're not, I like this picture because it's a very extreme example of this situation, but the most straightforward thing you can do is a 2-foot wide green space. If you can provide a 2-foot wide green space between the curb line and the sidewalk, you have met your requirement. If it has to be on the back, then that's when you need the curb. Yes, sir. It is for roundabouts, but it is also listed under the pedestrian access route as well. It shows up in both places. And I guess, let me also be clear, we are not talking about sidewalk along the main line that's directly off the back of curb. We're not talking about sidewalk where there's a curb ramp at one side and it's wrapping around that radius. I guess what I'm talking about here is solely the situation in which you have an entire quadrant of an intersection in which you don't want pedestrian crossings at that quadrant. And as I've stated before, there's a very real chance that I could be wrong on this, so I will certainly look into it as well. And I think, like the gentleman mentioned, the access board's a great resource for this. As you have questions, ask those questions. I'll do a bit of digging on this. I think I'm right, but there's always a chance that I'm not. I am always willing to be wrong.
Okay, so we're gonna go on to more common standards with ramps. We're getting some diagrams to help you kind of visualize what our meaning by this. So when we talk about ramps, there's clear width that's gonna be involved or the utilized space within the curb ramp. So a clear width within curb ramp runs, excluding any of the flares outside the walking area, outside of the ramp itself, to be a minimum of 48 inches. Notice that is the same minimum as your sidewalks as well. This is also included that if your sidewalk is going to be 5 foot or it's going to be 6 foot, that also includes that your clear width for your ramp or the width of your usable space in that ramp is gonna be the 5 foot or the 6 foot of what you've designated your walking space to be. So curb ramps shall be entirely within the crosswalk, as I mentioned earlier. So when you go back and you redo a curb ramp itself and you add 2 perpendicular ramps at where existing parallel was, you're gonna need to redo the crosswalk itself as well as that. So that's something to keep in mind for any type of project you go forward with for your cost estimates or anything like that, that the pavement markings are included as well. But again, to try to reutilize this, if you have 5 foot sidewalk, you have a 5 foot width ramp. You have a 6 foot wide sidewalk, you have a 6 foot wide ramp. If you go to the minimums of 4 foot, that'll get you through clear space. Any questions on that? Okay. Going on further definitions. This is gonna be repeated over. I have some visuals afterwards, but for majority of ramps, these are all gonna stay standard. When we're talking about run slope at a maximum, we're going through a 1 to 12 or 8.3 at the maximum of your run slope. That is what you're utilizing to go down your ramp to the grade of road or from your pedestrian access route. You don't run sideways, you run forward, that's your run slope. It's an easy way to remember it. Your cross slope is always going to be for 1 to 48, 2.1 as your maximum. It's a design suggestion. It's easy to design to 1.5. That gives you some leeway under construction. We're all human. Human error will occur without construction, and anyone that's ever been involved on the job site knows if you form it just wrong, that can throw you out of compliance. So it's an easy suggestion designed to 1.5 in mind that you will get some push and shove when you're forming up concrete. It helps you to minimize your impact of being inaccessible when you're done with your construction sites. Grade breaks are at the tops and the bottoms of curb ramps, and they shall be perpendicular to the direction of that curb ramp. So just as an easier understanding, so here's a diagram. This is pointing out our grade breaks at the top and the bottom of a perpendicular curb ramp. You see our road grade is coming down left to right, so our cross slope is going to follow as such at a 2.1 max. And again, if you need to drop these down or draw these again, these will all be online again, so you don't need to darkening artistic. But it'll run slope at maximum of 8.3. So again, going from your grade break from the top of the ramp to the bottom of the ramp, you have a maximum 8.3, maximum cross slope 2.1. Your clear width areas, again, this is going to be your landing area that we were talking about earlier, 48 by 48 inches or 4 foot by 4 foot at a minimum. It should be provided at the bottom of the grade break and the top of the grade break next to the crosswalk. This is a lot different than what we have with a parallel ramp because you're going to have 2 clear space areas. So those all have an extent of clear width area of maximum 5% when you match the road grades. So that's when you come down onto the street grade, you have a maximum of 5% to deal with. So you're gonna have to do some redesign of that shelf of the road. But when you do any kind of change of grade on your road slope, this is what can activate you changing a ramp slope as well. So for a better visual, you can see the top where we had grade breaks at. Now we have a 48 by 48 minimum landing at the top. And we have a 48 by 48 clear space in the bottom as well, next to the crosswalk as well. And I think beforehand, I forgot to say about flare slopes as well. Yeah, flare slopes are a maximum of 10%. When you measure your flare slope though, don't go and put your 2 foot level onto the curb. The curb is not what you're measuring the flare. This is where you can get in trouble if you're floating concrete and you shove a little too hard, that flare can start getting punched up and then you're flying into 15%. This is why it's hard for some individuals when you're out there measure correctly, but you always go parallel to that flare or to that curve of where the flare is gonna be. It's easier to set your curve first, then work with your flares, set your grade so that you know it's exactly less than 10% or at a max 10%, and then come in with your 8.3 at maximum run slope. Just as a design standard, it helps out when you're on construction. Does that make sense about the clear space on the roads? Everyone following that? Yes.
Question on the road grade exemption
Mhm.
for crossflow.
Mhm.
So if your road is running at 5%, crossflow is gonna be,
Mhm.
so if it gets, I mean, is that acceptable or?
Maybe.
Yeah, racking the maybes. So,
Yeah, it depends on, number one, the scope of work and what you're doing. And number two, if this is at a stop controlled intersection, then the requirement is a 2% cross slope. If it's at a yield controlled intersection, then that's where we get up to the 5%. And it's really sort of what you're doing with the road. If it's a roadway reconstruction project and you have a stop sign there, then you need to reconstruct that back at 2%. If it's, say, you're just going and putting in new sidewalk as part of a sidewalk project, then most likely your scope of work is not going to take you out into the road. But if you ever touch the road, then you'll need to bring that up to code, up to meet the guidelines at that point. So it's kind of based on what else is going on with the project.
Typically, actually, we were working on a project where we were just doing sidewalk. And there was no way to get it into compliance because the road grade was, I think, 5.5%. So there's no way to match, go into the road, you know,
Yeah,
where it stops. So,
yeah.
okay.
So yeah, so in that case, I would say you're going back at the road. Well, if you ever reconstruct the roadway, at that point, what worked for this project, yeah, probably isn't going to work for the next time you do this.
Top and bottom of the ramp. So if you're in that scenario, if you're 5.5% across the bottom, you also do 5.5% across the ramp.
The way the Prowag reads, the answer is yes. The way the IDOT standards currently are read, IDOT, the way I read the IDOT standards is that they want the level landing up at the top. I don't know where the IDOT standards are going in the future, but per the current IDOT standards, that's not the way the current IDOT standards are presented.
You would level it out. But you get
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Does the crosswalk on the road, like,
So the question is, does the cross slopes on the road apply to resurface or reconstruction? And my answer was a bit of a discomforted face look.
change your grades.
The way I read the Prowag standards is as long as, so the maximum grade break's 13.3%. The way that I read it is if your scope of work is resurfacing, you do the best that you can possibly do. There is a chance that other people may have different interpretations of that. And I think you flush that out early in the process to make sure that you're meeting whatever your review agencies is expecting you to do. I've heard it both ways. To be honest with you, I've done it both ways. I don't have a clear-cut answer for you on that. I don't. Question for the video was, in sort of the MFT world, is there sort of clear guidelines on what the expectation is? And as far as I know, I've never seen clear guidelines. I would suggest coordinating with whoever sort of your contact person is to find out what the expectation is for you on that. Question in the back. Okay, so the question is, when we say the word stop controlled, are we referring solely to stop signs and not necessarily traffic signals that could have through movements on top of a stop controlled movement? That's always the way I've interpreted it, is that stop signs is a stop sign. So yeah, that's always been the way I've interpreted it. I'm guaranteed to get myself in trouble on one of these, so we'll see how this goes, but I'm willing to try.
Okay. Also, just to give an example of this clear space, because I'm gonna go into parallels, and you're gonna see that there's not gonna be a need for the clear space area outside of that. So when you're entering the street or coming from the street onto your ramp, you need an area to square up and prepare yourself as someone's in the chair to go up that said ramp. That's the idea behind having a clear space out there, is to give yourself an area to straighten up and get out there. Also to have an area to land and impact onto the road as well. This will be different for a parallel. We'll have another diagram and make it a little more clear about that. So again, to reiterate, parallel ramps in the same run slope, cross slope, 8.3 at a maximum, 1 to 12, cross slope being 1 to 48, 2.1%, except for the road grade exception that we had just discussed earlier. So we're going into parallel ramps. So you can see we're gonna have 2 running slopes that match down into a cross slope area that's going to fall into road grade. That is our landing area. That is why you're not needing 2 separate clear spaces for a parallel ramp. And again, parallel ramps are going to come from large radius returns where you're going to have one adjacent sidewalk coming through. You can drop down to road grade and have that exception out there where you're going to follow a match road grade. So you're not going to need an area to prepare yourself to go up because you're in the safety of the sidewalk or your pedestrian access route to be able to access either up or down the other running slopes of the sidewalk itself. The follow through grade breaks again are the top and the bottoms of the curb ramps. And they should be perpendicular to the direction of that curb ramp. So just go further through. This is your landing area with your grade breaks. This is what we're talking about. You have running stuff coming down to that landing area. So there's no clear width area outside in that road. For anyone in the back, they can see all these grades. And this is going to be a minimum of 48 inches or 4 foot by 4 foot. Again, this still stands true if you have a 5 foot sidewalk. It's going to be 5 foot by 5 foot, 6 foot sidewalk, 6 foot by 6 foot. That's going to give yourself that landing area on a parallel ramp. Any questions going forward? We can keep going to blended transitions. Okay. Just to reiterate, 8.3, that's the magic number of your maximum, 2.1 is your maximum on cross slope. So here's another diagram of a blended transition. We have our 4 sets of grade breaks here. We have one on our left side, the very bottom, the very top, and on the right side, vice versa, on the bottom and the top. So 4 separate grade breaks that come down to a shared landing area. That's our blended transition, your blended area of 2 ramps together. So you're gonna have a maximum run slope on either side of 8.3. Again, don't try to build to the absolute maximum. That's where you're gonna get yourself in trouble. Don't design to the absolute minimum, same way. You have a cross slope of 2.1 falling off onto road grade for visuals. And then you can see what I was talking about for the crosswalks themselves. It's going to go from edge of the detectable warning panel out to the edge of the detectable warning panel on the far side too. Truly, they should extend out even further, but we wouldn't be able to see it if it's off the screen. So where blended transition serves more than one pedestrian circulation path. So you have 2 sets of sidewalks adjoining at the same time. The run slope greater than 1 to 48 or 2.1. Pedestrian access route shall be provided so that pedestrians not crossing the street can bypass this blended transition area. So this is this area that we're talking about in the landing. This landing area is a clear width area. So having the minimum 4 foot area inside that landing needs to be an area. So if someone comes down the far left side, so they're walking down the street, they can go around and then come back out of this area of this blended transition. Kind of hard to see within the diagram. The idea is that they're not having to go down and go sideways, potentially causing a fallout of the chair, or if you're coming in at a different angle. So you're not hitting a point where you're at like a 7%, that you're now unattained cross slope that you're trying to hit. So that you're hitting a landing, being able to turn, transition back up, and then get out of that area of your blended transition. So everyone following with that? Okay, and again, these diagrams will all be downloadable, and all those numbers will still be up there. So you guys can come back and print those out, post them for your side, whatever is going to help for you. Now we're going to get into the fun talks of detectable warning surfaces. Travis. So.
Yeah. I think a couple of housekeeping items on the question related to the crosswalks. That's R302.5.2.3 is what specifically talks about crosswalks with traffic control signal. And that sets that at that 5% maximum slope. So yeah, that 5% maximum slope is established there. Detectable warning panels. Detectable warning surfaces have been controversial in the disability community since they were first thought up of. They are loved by the blind community. They are despised by the wheelchair community. And if you ever go to a disability ADA symposium, something like that, if you hear an argument between two different disability groups, there's a chance it's over detectable warning surfaces. They have changed a lot throughout the years, but this has sort of been the standard for the last 20, 25 years. As to this is the compromise that was sort of established through these various communities. And really what a detectable warning surface is it is a standardized surface feature built in or applied to pedestrian circulation paths or other pedestrian facilities to warn of hazards. The key thing there is, number one, a standardized surface. There are requirements, very specific requirements for detectable warning panels. I'll also note that it could be built in or applied. The Prowag is not stating that it has to be either the stick-on types that go on top of the sidewalk or the concrete ones that are embedded into the sidewalk. Both of those are acceptable as long as they meet the requirements of the detectable warning surfaces. And really what detectable warning surfaces exist for is to warn of hazards. So one thing I would caution you of is the answer is not to put a detectable warning surface everywhere. We've all seen the certain streets in which every single entrance we come across, somebody's put a detectable warning panel there. What happens is once you go through 2 or 3 of those, you kind of stop paying attention to them. Because when you're hitting them every 50 feet, are you really paying attention to it anymore? So there are places they have to go. There are clear requirements where they go, but don't just put them everywhere. Give some thought as to where they go, or else they're really going to stop their usefulness to the blind community. And these are really, really important to the blind community. Curb ramps and blended transitions shall have detectable warning surfaces. Sort of clear cut. I think we're all generally familiar with this requirement. Exception, detectable warning surfaces are not required on curb ramps used exclusively to connect parking spaces and loading zones, the comment from before. So then the big question becomes, what happens at driveways? And as we already talked about, pedestrian circulation paths at driveways controlled by yield or stop control devices or traffic signals, that's been taken from should to shall have detectable warning surfaces. For other entrances, engineering judgment is always allowed if you deem that there is value in having it there. But the shall applies to yield, stop controlled, signalized commercial entrances. These are some quick little details on what they have to look like. For the most part, the detectable warning panel manufacturers have gotten very good at meeting these requirements. I bring these up solely to state if you as a community want to say, these are the only detectable warning services that are allowed in my community, take the minute to make sure that they meet the requirements. Because by you stating that these are the ones that are allowed in our community, you've now taken the responsibility off somebody else and put it onto yourself. So take the couple minutes, look through the requirements, make sure that it meets. This is all fairly standardized, but you do still have a couple that pop up every once in a while that aren't within these parameters. This comes up as well. Contrast, the way that the guidelines read is that the detectable warning panels have to provide contrast with adjacent walking surfaces, either light on dark or dark on light. They don't provide, or none that I've ever seen has provided, a scientific definition of what the word contrast is. I've never seen a clear, it's got to be X amount of whatever for it to contrast. So this is in a historic district, and they have brick sidewalks, and they put in detectable warning panels that look very similar to the brick sidewalks. So in this case, I would argue that there's no contrast there. However, when this argument happened, the response was, okay, tell me what we need. And that's sort of where we ran a little bit short on that, is knowing what the clear definition of contrast is. But just know that there's a reason detectable warning surfaces are bright yellow, bright red. The goal is for them to be very, very visual. Because we're not just talking about the blind community here, we're also talking about the low vision community. So with the low vision community, yes, there is the ability to see, but we want these to stand out. We want these, I understand there might be a desire to have them blend in with the sidewalk because it, is more pleasing to an architect or landscape architect or whoever. But the goal here is for these to stand out, for these to matter. So just strongly encourage you to push back if you ever start to see that contrast isn't there. And if anybody knows of a number that they've seen contrast-wise, I would love to know what it is, because this feels like something that can be quantified. I've just never actually seen it quantified anywhere. Surface size. Detectable warning surfaces shall extend 24 inches minimum in the direction of travel. So that is from your curb line going backwards, they have to be at least 24 inches. And that 24 inches applies to the entire length of the curb ramp. So it's got to extend the full width. So if you have a shared use path that has a 10-foot curb ramp, you have 10 foot of detectable warning panels for that shared use path, because we have no way of quantifying where the blind or low vision person is going to walk. There's no expectation that they have to walk on the outer 5 foot or the inner 5 foot. The entirety of the 10 foot is available to them. So therefore the entirety of the 10 foot has to include the warning for them. Detectable warning surfaces shall be placed at the back edge of curb or no greater than 6 inches from the edge of pavement. So you can't set them 2 foot off the back of curb because that, for whatever reason, that feels better. The goal is to have them right on that curb line, because really what we're trying to do is shorten the distance that they have to travel between detectable warning surface and detectable warning surface. Where the distance from both ends of the grade break, I'll just switch over to the picture. Where the difference of both ends of the grade break is less than 5 foot, it's put perpendicular to the curb ramp. Where it's greater than 5 foot, that's whenever we wrap along the curb line. So 5 foot's kind of the magic number there. Of less than 5 foot, you're going to have a little bit of concrete on the far side between the detectable warning surface and the curb line. Once you get greater than 5 foot, that's whenever we're wrapping it along the curb line. That is consistent with IDOT standards as well. So that's sort of 5 foot, sort of your magic number there. Any questions? Oh, yes. I consider it a landing because IDOT considers it a landing. I have had many discussions with the US Access Board, and their feelings are a little bit different than IDOT's are on that. But for the most part, most of what I'm involved in is work where we have to meet IDOT standards, and the IDOT standards do consider that a landing. If you're working on a purely local project, Prowag does not have those strong feelings about that being a landing. So to me, the most important thing here, if you are not going to consider, the most important thing is that at this grade break here, that needs to be 1.5%, because that sets up the wheelchair person. That's the most important part of that. What exists, Access Board to me calls it the funky triangle. And what exists in that is up to debate. If you look at different state DOTs, there's like 10 different requirements. Every DOT has a different requirement for what exists within that triangle. In the state of Illinois, that is considered a landing per IDOT standards. And in this case, to me, that is very clearly the most stringent requirement. To consider that a landing is the most accessible way you can do it. So my official answer in the state of Illinois is that's a landing, until you guys release new standards and I can change my answer. Parallel and blended transitions. Detectable warning services shall be located so that both front corners of the warning are at the back of curb. I will note, this is a terrible curb ramp. I hate this curb ramp design. I include the pictures because they got the detectable warning panels right. What I don't like about this curb ramp design is that this whole sidewalk here is level. It's a 10-foot wide sidewalk, very good pedestrian access route, and they narrowed it down to 4 feet in order to get their curb ramp in. So that was that conversation that Nick was having earlier about the curb ramp matches the entire width of your pedestrian access route. So do not take this as a good example of curb ramp design, but for everything they got wrong, it is a good example of detectable warning panel placement. Does anybody want to, so those curbs were not originally painted yellow. Does anybody want to guess why those curbs got painted yellow? Because people kept tripping over them. So it became evident that it was not a great design very early in the process when people kept tripping over those curbs. Question. I think what they should have done instead of doing those curbs was to make those running slopes and to just lower that whole sidewalk down to the landing and to basically just slope the entirety of it. And if that didn't work, what they could have done was to do flares off the actual ramp side of it and then held the pedestrian access route on the back. So when you're in those situations where people might be walking, flares are always better than curbs. Because yes, you go down a slope and you might catch yourself, but you're not going to trip over that curb. That curb with that sharp face is where people have accidents. We'll go here first. Yeah, I think here, this is probably wide enough that you could provide a 4-foot wide pedestrian access route across the very back by the building, and then do your flares, do sort of diagonal flares instead of just lowering the whole sidewalk. Question over here. The technical services are red. No, you're good. It's a long day. Fair enough. Good for you. So the question is sort of color selection and how that color selection goes. To me, for the technical boarding services themselves, choosing between yellow and red, if you want to have a city standard, to me, it's just whatever standard is the most applicable for you. Some communities do sort of tinted concrete. So if you're getting into the world of red tinted concrete, I think that's where yellow is especially important. If you're doing colored concrete or anything like that, the most important thing is contrast. If you're just doing pure concrete sidewalks, I don't think red or yellow is necessarily better. I think it's just whatever works better for your community. Uh, there is no specific color options. Red and yellow are, I say, are the two most common options. The most important thing is contrast. I've seen black before. If you have, white concrete with black, that's contrasting. Where my concern with that is if you have asphalt streets and is the black detectable warning services starting to blend in with the asphalt, it might. The beauty of red and yellow is there's not much else red and yellow pavement wise out on a road. Yeah. If you have some that have been out for a while, I would go take a look and see, is this the result that we desire? Again, I don't think I can give you a clear yes or no, but if you go out and you hesitate, I think you know what your answer is. Yeah. I gotcha. So, any other questions? Oh, right here. Yes. In a perfect world, you would keep it. The 4 foot is the minimum requirement that you have to meet. So if it's going to cost you $20,000 to relocate a traffic signal, you don't have to relocate a traffic signal to main 10 foot. But if you have the room to do it, it's within right of way and it's another foot of grass, I think it's a great idea to do. But the minimum requirement is to maintain that 4 foot pathway. Any other questions? Okay, not seeing any, we are going to go to break. Coming out of breaks, we are going to dive in the world of crosswalks, roundabouts, APS, and all that good stuff. So it is currently 2:15, so let's get back together at 2:30 and we'll keep going.
That's so they didn't consider all the consultants that were pre-qualified. So they had to do, yeah.
Going again. Okay, so crosswalks and roundabouts. Crosswalks are covered in R306. Crosswalk specifically is the portion of a roadway that is located at the intersection and connects pedestrian circulation paths on opposite sides of the highway. Big thing on the crosswalks is that it doesn't matter whether it's marked or unmarked. Something does not become a crosswalk whenever you put pavement striping to turn it into a crosswalk. The fact that it goes from curb ramp to curb ramp is what makes it a crosswalk. So as you're going through this and you say, yeah, but we don't stripe that as a crosswalk, it already is a crosswalk whether you stripe it or not. Traveled way, the portion of a roadway for the movement of vehicles. This is going to come up whenever we talk about signal timing. But the big thing here is that does not include shoulder, berm, sidewalk, parking lane, anything of that nature. Traveled lanes are where the vehicles are driving. That does include turn lanes. So if you have turn lanes, that's part of the traveled way, but shoulder, sidewalk, etc., is not. Some sort of APS terms that you're going to hear as we go through this. The pedestrian change interval. That's the interval during which the flashing upraised hand, it could say don't walk, the flashing unraised hand has sort of become the standard. That's whenever that is displayed. The walk interval is whenever the walk sign or the walking guy exists. So within Prowag, those are both clearly defined as sort of what those timings are based on. So anytime you're looking at pedestrian signal phase timing, Prowag specifically states a speed of 3.5 feet per second. That is faster than you think it is. But this is sort of like everything in life. This is the compromise between we got to get vehicular traffic through and we got to get pedestrians through. So 3.5 feet per second is where that is based on. Another thing that I'll throw out here is that that clearance time is measured from push button to push button. So as you're working with your consultants, or if this is something that you guys do in-house, the timing is not based on whenever they hit through lane number 1 to whenever they leave through lane number 2. Because realistically, they're going to be set up at the push button when they start. So it's taking into account where they start from, and then once they reach the next push button, that's theoretically the landing or the safe place that they're going to. So this timing goes from push button to push button. So again, not necessarily something that you need to know, but it's a good thing to kind of throw out to make sure that whoever's doing your traffic signal plans is sort of taking all this into account. So we'll get into APS in a second. Wanted to switch back over to roundabouts for a second, because we talked about earlier, a lot of changes to Prowag as sort of roundabouts become more and more common throughout the United States. Prowag is sort of catching up to what those requirements need to be. So for anybody who might not know, roundabout is a circular intersection with field control at entry, which permits a vehicle on a circular roadway to proceed counterclockwise around a central island. So the big change here for pedestrians is that there are no stop signs, there are no signals. Everything that makes a roundabout good for a car is what can potentially bring pedestrians into conflict, because the cars aren't forced to stop. So Prowag has some very specific requirements when it comes to roundabouts. So where pedestrian crossing is not intended. So for roundabouts, if you don't want them to cross into the roundabout at that location, we're back to that 24-inch minimum landscape area, or the detectable edge treatment, 15-inch maximum above the sidewalk. So most likely not a fence, could be a curb. I will say the best solution for this, if you have the space and you have the maintenance ability to maintain it, is that 24-inch clear zone between the sidewalk and the curb line. If that's not an option, then that's whenever you get into option one and you start looking at your alternative options. And really the reason this is here is if you imagine that you're someone who's blind, at these roundabouts, you're kind of doing some odd movements. You're kind of going, and there's an expectation that there's going to be a crosswalk there. So you're trying to make it clear to the user that this is not a safe place for you to cross. Already hit on this as well, but listed here again, just because it's important for those multi-lane segments, traffic signals, hybrid beacons, raised crosswalks, things of that nature. If you're getting into the world of multi-lane roundabouts, just something to be aware of. Also worth noting here that it is the segment of the roundabout. It also includes any multi-lane channelized turn lanes that come out of that roundabout. So if your roundabout has a slip lane that allows someone to make a free flow movement outside of the roundabout, and that's multi-lane, that also falls under this as well. So we already covered most of this morning, but again, the big thing here is just to be aware of it and to ask those questions and to just sort of, hopefully this triggers something in your mind when that next roundabout project does come up. So pedestrian traffic signals. A push button. That's the button to activate a device or signal timings for pedestrians, bicyclists, whoever. The push button locator tone. That's the little buzz that you hear, the little beep that you hear that guides someone to where that push button is located. So that is not the walk now sound that we're talking about. I describe it like a chirp. It's almost a little chirp that allows someone who's low vision or blind to know how to get to that push button. It has nothing to do with crossing, everything to do with finding the push button. Vibrotactile, you will see the word vibrotactile throughout these Prowag standards. That is a method of communicating information by touch using a vibrating surface. If you've ever seen this on a pedestrian push button, that's whenever you push the button to activate it and it kind of shakes a little bit. That's what vibrotactile is. It is an alternative form of letting someone know that the button is pressed. In this case, particularly the deaf community, you might say, yeah, but whenever I press my push button, there's a chirp sound that tells me that I've activated it. How does that work if you're deaf? If you're deaf, you have the vibrotactile option. Really what these APS signals are about is about multi-method communication. We communicate one way, but we have another way of communicating as well. Accessible pedestrian signal, it's a device that communicates information about pedestrian signal timing in non-visual forms, such as audible tones, speech messages, vibrating surfaces. Pedestrian activated warning devices, devices that are used in conjunction with a warning sign and alert vehicle operators to the presence of pedestrians. These are your rapid rectangular flashing beacons, your hawk signals, things of that nature. So those also have clear requirements under Prowag. So if you find yourself putting in any of those pedestrian activated signals at mid-block crossings, know that there are Prowag guidelines that guide that as well. Traffic control signals. Again, I will note, this is for new traffic control signals, reconstructed traffic control signals, altered traffic control signals. As we talked about earlier this morning, swapping out a signal head doesn't automatically mean that you have to do this now. But if you are putting in new, if you are reconstructing, if your review agency requires you to put these in for whatever reason, that's when all this APS stuff comes into play. So where pedestrian signal heads are provided, the walk indication shall comply with R308. So R308 basically states what that walk indication looks like. Big thing here, several communities have tried to get creative with their walk indicators. Maybe you're in a music section and they want like a guy playing guitar to be the walk. It sounds silly, it's happened, like there's a reason they put these regulations in. The this is straightforward. They want the walk guy, they want the hand. So if you ever get in a conversation of, oh, we can make this signal head really cool, that's not what, that's not the expectation. Pedestrian signal heads must have a pedestrian push button or passive detection or pre-timed operation. So passive detection pre-timed is still acceptable, but it has to have audible or vital tactile indications. So what you see now for a lot of passive is they'll mount on top of the mast arm a chirping device that'll communicate to you the same way that the pedestrian push button does for APS. So passive is not banned, I'll say, through accessible pedestrian signals, but just know that if you do have passive pedestrian detection, that those requirements for alternative cues pass through for passive as well. Activation wise, pedestrian push button and passive detection, whichever one it is, it has to activate the accessible pedestrian signals and where applicable, the walk signals. This sounds silly, but how many of you have pedestrian push buttons that don't actually do anything today? If we're honest with ourselves, we all probably have one somewhere. Whether it's yours or whether it's IDOT in your community, there's probably one there that doesn't work. So if you have a pedestrian push button, make sure it does something. So you're not gonna be able to hear the audio here, but the way this works is you press it, and upon pressing it, it makes that little chirping noise to let you know that it has been pressed. So pedestrian push buttons, whenever you put in new pedestrian push buttons, they have to include that location tone, that sound that guides you to them. Very specific requirements on the tone. I don't expect you to know these, just know that they exist. So 0.15 seconds or less, 5 decibels above the ambient temperature, above the ambient sound, that's all out there. So just as you get into this, know that there's very, very specific requirements on what they're looking for from these. I will also note that these are adjustable. So if you get a new APS signal in and it's loud and you can hear it from 200 feet away, you can turn that down. That's doable. If you get a new one in and you can't hear it from 2 feet away, you can turn it up. You are not committed to whatever sound it comes out of the box at. They are, yes, ma'am. Let me make sure I'm answering. Yeah, so to me, what that means is you're gonna have to you're gonna have to make field adjustments for what's going on in the actual thing. So they don't tell you that it has to be X specific decibels because it might not be appropriate based on the site. Oh, okay, I got you, yes. So it can certainly do that, and that is a thing. But if it's kind of acting a little haywire, there's ways to make it better. That's all I'm trying to say with that, is that if it seems way out of whack, there's probably something going on. There's ways to figure it out. I think we've ran into a number of communities that have turned theirs off because it's too loud and people complain about it. When in reality, the answer is it was way too loud for these standards. It wasn't even meeting the standards that existed. For whatever reason, it came out of the box really loud and it wasn't making these adjustments. So I guess that's the main thing I'm trying to get across here, is just know that, don't just turn them off because they're too loud. Work through the process, you can get there. Orientation and tactile arrow. The face of the push button shall be parallel to the associated crosswalk. Most of these push buttons now have that tactile arrow that points at it. That's there for a reason, and that is directionality clues for people. So every once in a while, you'll see one of these in which it'll have the arrow and it'll just point you into the grass because that wasn't thought about during the process. The arrow's there and the arrow serves a very specific purpose for people. So match that arrow up with the crosswalk. That's one of those things that sounds obvious, but I've seen enough of them wrong now that I feel inclined to mention it because it certainly does happen. So it's got to be a tactile arrow, and again, high contrast. If you have a black background, silver, white. If you have a white background, black. Something that allows the low vision people to pick up on those arrows. We want this to be obvious. We want this to be very clear as to where they're pressing and what they're doing. Push button wise, requirement wise, push button shall be located no greater than 5 foot from the side of the curb ramp run. Again, from sort of the most basic level, we want somebody to be able to push the push button and then go straight through the curb ramp. We don't want them pushing a curb button that's 40 feet away, then they got to wheel around, come back, line themselves up on the curb ramp, then they didn't make it, so they got to go back and do it again. So these requirements are all about functionality for the user. So no greater than 5 foot from the side of the ramp run. Push button shall be located between 1.5 and 10 feet. The way that the Prowag reads, it prefers 6 feet. 6 feet is the desired. In my experience, getting it in with 6 feet is often a major challenge. So it does allow you to go up to 10 feet in certain situations. I do want to note that sort of the base requirement is 6 foot. You can go up a little bit more if you need to. And again, this is that we want that crossing distance to be as short as possible. We don't want it to be 40 foot back because now instead of crossing a 24-foot road, they're realistically crossing a 64-foot road. This is the other big headache, I'll call it, that people have when it comes to APS. The requirement that where 2 push buttons are provided on the same corner, they shall be more than 10 feet or more apart. We all know there are situations where that just doesn't happen. So they provide an exception. In alterations where technically infeasible, to provide 10-foot separation between the push buttons, a pedestrian push button with a speech walk method complying with that standard shall be provided. So 2 things there. Number 1, the word in alterations. The expectation for, again, if we remember what's not an alteration, that is new construction on new public right-of-way, is that those push buttons are always going to be more than 10 foot apart. If you're in a situation where that can't happen, now we're getting into the world of these pedestrian push buttons that talk to us. So this is the reference in Prowag that gets us into the world of the talking pedestrian push buttons. So if you can push them out to more than 10 foot, that's always the best solution. Otherwise, we're now talking to each other. APS shall have audible and vibral tactile walk indication during the walk interval only. One of the things that APS does is it provides guidance on when you can start walking, and it stops sooner than the signal does because it's trying to help with that timing. You know, as soon as it switches over to don't cross, the audible and vibral tactile walk indication goes away because it's not safe for them to start the crossing at that point. The audible walk indication shall be audible from the beginning of the associated crosswalk. So if you've ever seen these in action, they kind of talk you through the crosswalk. There's a cross at the beginning and there's a cross at the end. And that audible side of it kind of serves as the guide to sort of guide you through the crosswalk. Then following the pedestrian change interval, it goes back to the locator tone. So it's not required to always be talking. It's talking whenever someone's pushed it and it needs to talk. Question? So basically, whenever it's time to cross, that little arrow will start shaking. So via push button. So the push button itself is basically serving as the indication. So it'll kind of shake a little bit, and that's sort of the vibro-tactile clue that you're good to go. Question was for the recording, sort of how the vibro-tactile and how that works with the walk indication. Oh, question. So the question is, when the vibrotactile audio, whatever goes out, is there an indication to whoever maintains the push button that it has gone out? I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good question. Anybody who has APS signals, do you have any knowledge of sort of, is there a fail safe in case it's not working? It's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. Typically how we handle these questions is I will certainly find the answer and then I'll coordinate it back to CMAP, and then we can kind of get, it'll either go up on CMAP's website or we can get an email out to attendees. But yeah, it's a good question that I don't know the answer to. Question. It will be that corner and then the receiving ramp on the other side of the corner. Because it talks you through that crosswalk on both sides. By that point, maybe the better design is to put them at all sides. But I don't believe Prowag has a statement that once you have to do it once, you have to pass it throughout the entirety of the intersection. So that might be a good design practice, but I don't know where Prowag specifically states that you have to do it. I'll go behind first. So what the gentleman mentioned is that in his municipality, they contract with a third-party operator that basically checks in, communicates with these devices, and then follows back up with him if something is not working. And then I assume as part of that contract, they also make the required steps to bring them back into operation. Yeah. So the question is, if there's a pedestrian phase only traffic movement in which they can walk to basically all three of the quadrants from one of the quadrants, how does that work for APS? I don't know the answer to that question. My guess would be is that at that point, it's probably just says walk. And it's less sort of providing directionality and more just making you aware of the fact that you are now allowed to walk. But yeah, I don't know the specifics of that from an APS answer. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, so there is a completely separate section of Prowag that specifically talks about rapid rectangular flashing beacons and what the requirements are for that. It doesn't talk and say flash, but it does sort of chirp to make you aware that it is flashing. So it operates more like the 10-foot separation. in which it's not talking, but the vibrotactile does go off, and there is audible indications on both sides to sort of direct you in that direction. But they don't necessarily say cross Main Street. Correct. Yeah, so at that point, when the flashing stops, it'll go back to just a little locator tone chirp. So there'll still be the audible, the little locator tone chirp, but it won't be sort of that more high-pitched cross sound. It's much more of an ambient noise at that point. That is, of course, if they're operating properly. So where an APS is provided at a single crossing, or two APSs are 10 foot or greater from each other at the corner, the audible indicative shall be a percussive tone. So this also applies to those rapid rectangular flashing beacons as a single one. It is a percussive tone that is very quick, very high pitch. So it's 8 to 10 ticks per second. So if you imagine sort of how quick that's going off, it's a very quick sound. And then there is specific hertz requirements for that. If you get within 10 feet and you ever have to mess around with this, Prowag gives you the language that you have to use. It gives you the timing, it gives you the speech, all that. So the push button shall only be actuated when the walk interval is not timing. So if the walk interval is on and you walk up and push it, you have to wait for the whole next cycle before it goes. And in the meantime, it has to say wait, followed by the intersection indication for information. So wait to cross Broadway at Grand. So as soon as you press it, it's talking to you, it's communicating. Main reason it does that is so that somebody knows that they've done something. That is the verbal cue of you have pressed the button. It is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Speech information message that are used at intersections having pedestrian phasing that is concurrent with vehicular phasing. So if you cross at the same time that the traffic is going parallel to you, it'll say something to the effect of Broadway, walk sign is on to cross Broadway. So it is specifically telling you the street that you are allowed to cross. Then here's your answer for the exclusive pedestrians. Walk sign is on for all crossing. So this is for those exclusive pedestrian phasing, whether it's diagonal or not diagonal. You might have a situation in which you can cross all four quadrants at the same time. This is the specific language that is used for that. And again, ambient sound up greater than the ambient sound up to a maximum of 5 decibels. First place I ever saw one of these was at an intersection in San Antonio. And I know it existed because it kept me up all night, because it was not pedestrian actuated and it just talked all night long. It never stopped. So that was my first interaction with these. That was at an ADA symposium, actually. And I believe after that, the city got a phone call explaining how these are intended to operate. So if they're not functioning the way that you think they should, reach out to that third-party contractor, reach out to whoever put them in, and don't be afraid to ask those questions. Because in a perfect world, these are there, you notice them, but they are not the obnoxious thing that I think everybody thinks that they are. So if you find that you're getting a lot of complaints and you go out there and something feels wrong, there's a good chance that it is wrong, and check into it. And if that's the way it's supposed to be, then you're dealing with education. But these really do sort of blend into the background once you've been around them for a while. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. So that's all I got on APS. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next thing? Oh, right here.
They kind of got rid of some of the hard guidance of exactly. Like you mentioned, signal patterns. I guess these are the hard guidance.
I don't know the exact answer to that. To me, everything being on the same life cycle is always the best option. And I would assume that at some point, the access board is gonna come out with recommendations on what should happen. Sort of, as we talked about before, as stuff gets upgraded into the final rule, the advisory stuff goes away. But what happens is that advisory language is published after the fact. So my hope is that there'll be some more advisory language that comes out on this is what they consider to be best practices. So I don't know if there's a clear answer to that. I think my advice would be if you're already touching one of the quadrants, if you're already doing the curb ramps and everything out there, you might just be better off to do it once so that you're done with it. But I don't think I can tell you that you have to do everything because you're touching one pedestrian push button. I know we had another question somewhere.
APS, it has to be on a firm, stable, and consistent surface, right?
Yes,
So technically, it's clear space, right?
correct.
But if clear space, 400, it says that it shall not be located on curb ramp or clear.
Correct.
That complicates things with APS location.
Yes, and this is why I make that statement of most of the time you end up between that 6 and 10 foot number instead of on the 6 foot number. Because yeah, so this APS is considered an operable part, and operable parts fall under 403, 404. And basically operable parts have to be within an acceptable reach range. And they also have to have that clear space requirement in which, so that someone in a wheelchair can pull up and has somewhere to push that button. So these APS signals are not on the curb ramps, they're up on the top of the landings of these curb ramps. So yeah, placing these is not the most straightforward thing. It's not the easiest thing, but yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to meet that clear space. I don't talk about it here because we dive into it whenever we get to the 400 sections, but this is a location in which you got to make sure you have the reach range for it. So even though we say it has to be within 5 feet, that doesn't mean that you can have 5 feet of grass between the curb ramp and the push button. Because there's a whole separate standard on reach ranges in which you have to be within 10 inches from the clear space to where the operable part is. So, and then that clear space, it even goes as far to state that you can't have a clear space and you put it up at the very front of the clear space. Because if you imagine if you're in a wheelchair, your arm's back here, now you're reaching all the way up to try to activate it. So it has to be in that center 50% of the clear space. So for those of you that don't know, clear space is free of obstructions. It has the landings, so 2.1% cross slope. And it is within the reach range, which means that you can easily, whether it's high, low, or out, reach that operable part, reach that pedestrian push button. So we'll dive into a little bit into that in the future, but that 100% applies to these push buttons, that they have to meet all those requirements. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, it's not easy. I'm not here to say that it's easy. And that's why what you've started to see is we've gone away from the days in which we can just put these on the mast arms. Now we're getting into these sort of single poles that have the push buttons on them. That's why we're getting into those push buttons, is because the mast arms go where it's best for the mast arms, but now we need whole new posts to put the push buttons where the push buttons need to go. Any other questions before we move on?
All right, now we're gonna move on to bus stops, public transportation, bus shelters. Okay, so again, start with some definitions. The boarding platform itself. Platform raised above a standard curb height to allow access for pedestrians to enter public transit or to deboard for all right public transit. And so it's going to be higher than your standard curb height. This is for your buses. They will have airbag systems that can either raise up to create a level landing for someone in a wheelchair to come right onto it, or to drop down to get to their height, wherever that curve is for that boarding platform. Transit shelter, the structures provided at a transit stop for passengers. And again, I'll go on with that. A transit stop is an area that's designated for that boarding platform or transit shelter to give access for passengers to board or depart from public transit. Again, they all kind of flow in together. Boarding platform is for you to arrive on or off the bus routes or transit stops in general. Transit shelter is provided at these transit stops. We'll get into more, we have some more details again. So this is an area that's made for the boarding area, so a picture on the right side. So it must serve each accessible vehicle entry and exit. So that meaning anyone that is coming off for a different type of transit system, if that is a lift system that will drop down, if it is a airbag platform that you're able to access and get off on. And along with that, also dimensions shall be 96 inches or 8 foot at a minimum of width and depth, and a perpendicular measurement of 60 inches or 5 foot. Again, this is going to break down to your minimums and maximums. So when that shelf will come out and drop down onto an accessible lift ramp or a bus, it's going to come out 4 foot. So when you have that 4 foot, again, it's going to 8 foot so that you have a clear area outside when you roll off that platform to get out onto. That's the idea behind having an 8 foot drop out where you have this large platform. So again, a lot of these areas too, this is times when you'll see out a random bus pad out in the middle of nowhere in your cities, where it's just a 8 foot by 5 foot platform that you probably like, why is that out here? This is why it's out here. So keep going. So they break down these slopes and get a little confusing on how they phrase these. The slopes that parallel the street shall be the same grade as the street. So again, just to make this easier, your run slope of this bus pad is your run slope of your road, and your cross slope perpendicular shall be 2 to 1 maximum. This is your cross slope. So if I'm facing this bus pad, I enter the bus from my left side, my cross slope is still 2 to 1 max or 2.1 maximum cross slope. My run slope for that pad is still following the street grade. That's an easier way to try to get rid from the words out of here. And again, the surface shall comply with 302.6. This is your slip resistant surface that is standard for what we had talked about for sidewalks previously.
So the reason for the matching the slope of the road is if you've ever seen one of the buses operate, the way that it operates is that the loading platform comes down, but if that bus is at a 5% road grade, that platform is now at a 5% road grade. So if you build that bus stop with 2.1%, thinking, oh, it's a level landing, it's got to be 2.1%. It's not going to actually match up with the loading platform, and that creates that vertical displacement. So that's why it's specific about matching the running slope of the road, is because you've got to match the running slope of the road so that it can match the platform that the bus puts down to put people in. I'll also note, Nick mentioned it quickly, that you need it at the entry and exits. I would suggest taking some time to know how your buses load people. Does it load everybody from the front? Does it load the accessible from the back? Because if you put it within 10 foot of the intersection, but the accessible loading for your bus is on the back of the bus, now the bus has to pull into the intersection for the accessible loading for that person. So it's worth taking a little bit of time to know the buses that operate throughout your community so that you can make sure that whatever bus pads that you're providing works for those buses.
Move on to transit shelters. That's the structures out there that you'll see that have an overhang to protect you from weather protection. So the shelters will be connected by an accessible route themselves on the boarding platform. So our diagram on the right side, a little bit blurry, but you can see there's a structure, the individual in the wheelchair that has an accessible route that they're able to go out to the loading platform itself. These all still have minimum requirements as well. So that clear space inside the bus shelter will be a 30-inch by 48-inch. So I know that's a bit different, but it's giving an area that is clear space area that you're able to park your chair basically inside of the shelter. It gives you a width that is your own, that you're able to get onto an accessible route. That is the part of your accessible route of your sidewalk. So you potentially are gonna have overlapping accessible routes moved into each other. So with that in mind, when you're designing these, you're gonna have a shelter, or maybe you potentially have someone coming in afterwards to build a bus shelter. That's where this accessibility that you have in mind of where you're going to place these or have communication with the transit or metro systems. It's gonna be key here, so you can have flow through this, so you're not having where that bad example I showed you earlier, just a bus pad just being thrown out there, where now your accessible pathway is blocked. This is the incorporate both designs into knowing where your transit systems are gonna stop at. And where there's seating provided within the transit shelters, clear space shall be located at one end of the seat. So there might butcher this saying, if you discriminate against everyone, you're not discriminating against anyone. So the idea here is if you have a shelter with a seated area, you need to have a clear space area for someone in a wheelchair. But if you have no seating area, you do not need to. That does not mean you go and rip out all of your benches. That is not what I'm saying here. But I'm saying if you offer it, you need to also offer the accessible option as well. Environmental controls and proximity activated. So these are the, say, heating elements that you would have inside your bus shelters, or maybe timed lights so that you could have a twist option, turn lights on when it's night out to get onto these bus shelters. These need to be accessible as well, and within that reach range. We're getting more into the reach ranges here in a second. We'll dive into that. But the environmental controls shall be the proximity acted. You can read. Understand what I'm saying? So they will have an ability to be activated as you are inside the shelter. But there is no need to be automatically turned on, pushed off, or wasting electricity out there. The slope is parallel to the street, shall be the same grade as the street. Again, this is reiterating that run slope, so that when you're going on to the bus pad, so the bus was at an angle, that you're able to get on at that same angle. This is that cross slope and run slope we discussed earlier, along with the perpendicular shall be 2.1%. So again, following with the diagram on the right side, accessible route is going to follow your cross slope and your run slope. 2.1 cross, following matching your graded road slope to your bus pad, that is also going to have a 2.1 slope to your bus entrance. A lot of slopes, a lot of crosses, but if you have an accessible route through all of this, it'll flow easily through all of your metro station stops. Are there any questions? No. Okay, I don't think we need to take another 15-minute break unless we all feel like we really need to. Feel free to get up and use the bathroom, but I feel like we all are ready to continue powering on through the rest of this. All right, a lot of shaking heads. Okay, here we go. So we're gonna get into the technical requirements coming in for objects and protruding objects, not operable parts. So, protrusion limits. Objects with lead edges between 27 inches and 80 inches above the walking surface shall not outreach more than 4 inches onto your pedestrian access route. So for an example here, as this tree, if it's between 27 inches of a minimum and 80 inches of a maximum, it can't reach over into your access route 4 inches. Okay, that can go for anything between a sign, existing tree, say you have some new signage, lights, anything that protrudes off a building as well. So in this photo, you have a tree, you have a sign over there for the 1920, whatever this business is. You have some banners for your city. All of these can't swing over more than 4 inches. This exception though is for handrails, which can go to 4.5 inches into your accessible right of way. There's another diagram here in a second to give a little bit clearer area. So this bus stop sign here, it has a maximum 80 inches, and it can't protrude from the base of that pole more than 4 inches. As at the base of that pole, because if you have a thicker pole, the same size sign, but doesn't fall out more than 4 inches, that sign is good. But when you have such a skinny sign that you can kind of see, it overhangs that much, and it's that low, that's now becoming a vertical impairment for someone with a visual impairment that can't see this, initially just could come and hit them in the head. And also the clear width areas and everything else wrong with this photo, but the support part is the sign, which we're trying to break down here. So objects again between 27 inches and 80 inches shall not be more than 4 inches. So objects mounted between posts, this could be anything from your seasonal banners for your downtown events. This can be large signs you hang between light poles. This could be any type of signage that you have that's existing permanently in your access right of way. If their posts are greater than 12 inches, the lowest they should be is 27 inches as a maximum, or 80 inches above the walking surface itself. So again, this is that same height range. You're coming into that, just that you're trying to avoid anyone getting their head hit that isn't able to see, or is going to have overhang into your pedestrian access route. Again, this is the same standard for trees, for signs, permanent signage that you would have out there, or temporary signage that you could have out there as well. So vertical clearance, this is your 80-inch minimum that we're talking about. This is a good example where it's a clear area where you see that I have at least 80 inches above me. So 6'8" that will have clearance, so you're not going to come have any reason for it to drop down and hit you. Another example further down that way is you would have a park department or anyone else that could potentially cut down those trees, so they don't have branches there digging down too. This does not mean anytime it rains, you need to go immediately cut down a bunch of trees. We understand that trees will move, trees do grow, but it is something to keep in mind that when you have larger trees in more in older parts of your cities, that this will potentially become a hindrance that it will drop down into that range where you need to clip areas.
I think this sign is also a good reminder of it could be a different department in your city, county, governmental agency that is approving these signs. It could be someone else whose job it is to sign off on these signs. So there's a chance that you don't even see this before it goes up, because yes, you maintain the public right of way, but this could be community development, economic development that's signing off on the signs. So involve yourself as much as you can in these conversations, or make sure that whatever you need in your public right of way to have that be accessible is clearly expressed to those other agencies within your community. Because yes, they can put the sign in, but at the end of the day, you're the one who doesn't have the compliant public right of way anymore.
Temporary conditions. Temporary conditions can impact accessibility. So the low edge of guards and barriers should be located 27 inches maximum. Walking surface, as we discussed, visualize the walking environment for someone with a disability. So what this photo is trying to show is, it's kind of hard to see. There's this pole right here that these straps are being tied down to. This is for a temporary tent that's down in downtown for a festival. But what someone didn't realize is that now this is causing a visual impairment and also vertical displacement with inside of your right of way and your public access route. So now that these banners have been tucked down underneath there, the straps are now falling within being able to just being run straight into. They're a trip hazard, they're a vertical hazard, and they're also causing impairment between your public access route.
So the way we make these presentations is, I came across this at like 9:30 last night in Burr Ridge. Took a picture of it, added it this morning. So, and what this is if you're coming from the far side here and you're blind, you're going to walk straight into that strap before you hit anything else. And this is a case in which it's a perfectly designed sidewalk. What it is something else has been added to that sidewalk to create an accessibility concern. And this is, again, that friendly reminder of other agencies in your city like to add things to our public right of way. So let's make sure that they understand what their obligations are, or at least know to call you before they put something into the public right of way that can create an issue.
Operable parts, so Travis and I were talking about earlier, is a component or element used for inserted or withdraw objects, or to activate, deactivate, or adjust an element or interact with elements. So this could be your pedestrian push buttons, this could be your heating elements inside buses or lights inside your bus shelters, excuse me. So operable parts have their own distinct laws that you'll have to have between 5 pounds or under 5 pounds to operate said button. Cannot be a twist, and that cannot be a motion to pull up. It needs to be simply with one hand being under 5 pounds to operate this said piece of equipment in order to have it be acceptable. So here as well as there's height requirements. On this right side, you can see this new push button. It's one of the vibrating textile buttons that will show you direction. It's within its height range. It's also within its reach range as well. You can see all the signage. And what's hard to tell is there's also a little clear piece there as braille. This is part of their new sign design that they have down in St. Louis, where we took this photo. So someone that is visually impaired is also able to tell which direction the arrow is telling them to go. They can also read the braille and telling them exactly how far or what operation is needed to get that sign to work for them. For definitions of reach range. So reach range is required for elements with operable parts. This is we were talking about the push buttons earlier. Specific minimum and maximum heights. So we're going from between 36 and 40 inches. The different heights are based on parallel side reach in front. So again, you're coming on a clear space area, it needs to be within 10 inches of that area. If you're someone in a wheelchair, say you can't be leaning forward, they need to be within just seated area to be able to reach this operable part. So again, there's a lot of ranges that are going to come into trying to get a single piece of equipment to be accessible for an individual that's at the top of the landing to access this ramp appropriately. So again, it's going to be 36 to 40 inches within 10 inches of your clear right of way. It's under 5 pounds. Level. So discussed this earlier. Level is calling out 2.1 maximum cross slope and run slope on clear width area. So a level of landing is clear of obstructions and for the operable part or at operable parts. So that means no overhang, there is no tree branches that are coming into it, there's no overlaps of bushes, there are no signs that are underhanging. This clear area is truly no other parts outside of that operable force area, operable part area, excuse me, is being accessed. But when the exception is when there's a slope, a clear space that exceeds 2.1 in either both directions due to the grade of the adjacent road, pedestrian access route, the slope of the clear space may be consistent with the slope of the pedestrian access route. So again, this is that when your road is at like a 7%, you're going to have a operable part that's going to be needed to cross here. That's when you have that exception that you can use the operable part, the pedestrian access route, as your area to follow through as a clear space. That can be over 2.1%. But any questions about that? Yeah. Again, operable parts within bus stops. Operable parts with other fixed elements can be used in pedestrians shall be compliant. This is that under 5 pounds I was talking about. So on this right side, it's hard to tell. You have a sign over here, and you have your pedestrian seating. So you have a clear width area on the left side and the right side for something that's a wheelchair that can be used inside of this area as well. Operable parts, other fixed elements, transit stops, shelters shall be compliant. Again, the same operation that if you're going to give this as an option, everyone needs to have accessibility to that option. So we have a light, we have a heating fixture, we have a seat, it needs to have the same accessibility for everyone. And again, this is starting to get the same competitive, but clear space is complying with R404. This is your 4-foot minimum on each direction. Your clear space is going to be 2.1 maximum cross. If it follows the road grade, it's your exception. Within reach range specific. So this push button down here, you see it's at the top of the landing, but it's flared out to get away from the flare itself. You see where that darker area is. Push button's on the back side of it. So that's within its reach range. There's no other obstructions on the back side of it. So now that's considered an accessible point of access for that operable part. The slope of the clear space is 2.1. in both directions. This is, again, we go over the same thing as any other landing clear width. This is why having an optical part for push buttons is better off to be at the top of your landing. You already have an accessible ability, an accessible pedestrian access route. That's going to match into your optical part area or push button. It's an easy way to say it. And it's within and shall be within 30 inches of 48 inches. This is the height requirement I discussed earlier. So it's gonna be under 5 pounds, 30 to 48 inches, within 10 inches of your reach range in a clear space area. Forward parallel approaches. Height reach is gonna be 48 inches the maximum, and a low is of 15 inches. So for forward reach, again, this is for someone that's in a chair so that they don't fall out while reaching out to operate this part. It's going to be 40 to 15 inches of reach range inside here. For the forward reach, obstruction, clear space elements are not permitted. So nothing in between that area of clear space. So sometimes you'll see pedestrian push buttons put out onto your bumper area. That area in between push button and where your clear space area not be more than 15 48 inches.
You're good.
And so we're gonna move on finally to Prowag supplement technical requirements. It's gonna continue on with our definitions.
So a couple cleanups from our last APS discussion. In that section 404 that we just talked about with clear spaces, it specifically states that clear spaces shall not be located on curb ramp runs or flares. So that is specifically mentioned under that clear space requirement, that it has to be outside of the ramp runs, it's got to be outside of the flares, because it has to be in that level landing. I will also add to it that that exception is on there for matching the running slope. But if you're using part of the curb ramp landing for your clear space, you could also fall under the IDOT standards, which have the level landing up at the top. So again, this is another example in which the IDOT standards might be a little more stringent, in which, yes, you can match the running slope for the clear space per the Prowag standards. But if that clear space is the same as your curb ramp landing, the IDOT standards are going to have a level landing at the top as of this moment, subject to change, but as of this moment. So I think you can start to see how this is all kind of tied together. And it's not easy, but this is certainly something that you can do. And my best recommendation to you is to just kind of go through the standards, go through the requirements, and just kind of check the boxes as you go along. So wrapping this up, we're going to spend just a couple minutes talking about elements that are inside our pedestrian access route, inside our pedestrian circulation route. But often what they do is they serve sort of the neighboring businesses that are adjacent to our routes. So first off, we have a ramp. Again, we've already talked about this definition once, but it's important to hit on again. First thing is that it is not part of the pedestrian circulation path that follows the road grade. So following the road grade exception, it does not make it a ramp. Secondly, a curb ramp is not a ramp. But if for some reason you do find yourself with a ramp, and where I think we see this the most is ramps that come off of the public sidewalk and provide that access into those buildings. Running slope is going to be your 1 to 12, 8.3% maximum slope. Cross slope is going to be that 2.1%. Your clear width is 48-inch minimum. This is an exception that goes back to the 2010 ADA standards. If that is a ramp that serves a building entrance, it only has to be 36 inches wide. And I guess just to be clear on how we measure ramps, ramps are measured from the inside of the handrail to the inside of the handrail. So you can have 36 inches of concrete that makes a ramp. But if you have a handrail that's 4 inches inside on one side and 4 inches inside on the other side, your functional clear space is only 28 inches wide. So anytime you talk about clear width on ramps, that is measured from the inside face of the handrail to the inside face of the other handrail. Other big part of this, our maximum rise is 30 inches. So if we go up 30 inches, we have to provide a level landing. And then we can go up another 30 inches if we have to go up another 30 inches. So all that's feasible. Ramp landings. Ramps have to have landings at the top and the bottom of the ramp. And those landings have to be 2.1% maximum in all directions. There is no roadway grade exception for ramps. So yes, your road might be falling at 5%, but if you have to put a ramp in for some reason, that landing at the bottom of the ramp and at the top of the ramp have to be that 2.1% max in all directions. The clear width, the landing clear width has to be as wide as the ramp. So if for some reason you put in a 10-foot ramp, your landing clear width is now 10 foot as well. So however wide your ramp is how wide your landing is. And the landing clear length shall always be 60 inches. So if it's 4 foot, 10 foot, whatever it is, it always has to go back 60 inches. Main reason for that is that it provides that area for the wheelchair to spin around, set up, and get ready to attack that ramp. If you ever have a ramp that changes direction, that can be 90 degrees, 180 degrees, whatever direction it changes, then it has to be a 60-inch by 60-inch landing for that ramp. So if you have a ramp that just goes up to the top and then that's where it accesses it, it can be a 3-foot wide ramp with your 60 inches back for the landing. But if once they get to the top, if they have to turn to go anywhere, now you get into your 60 inches by 60 inches because that wheelchair has to do that turning motion. And that 36 inches wide for the turning motion just isn't wide enough for a wheelchair. We go over ramps pretty quickly because honestly, we just don't see it that much. But if for any reason you do ever find yourself dealing with ramps, if you go to R407, it guides you through that ramp process. Stairs. So where provided on the pedestrian circulation path, the stairs shall comply with R408. So if you have stairs that are located off right of way that goes to a house, that's not part of your pedestrian circulation path. Those stairs might have requirements under the IBC or residential code or anything else, but those are not PROAG covered stairs. These are stairs that are within the pedestrian circulation path. I think this is fairly obvious, but I'll note it. Stairs can never be part of the pedestrian access route. So your accessible route, that magic 4 foot that we've been talking about all day, you can't have stairs within that pedestrian access route. But within the circulation route, you can have stairs if it's warranted. If you do happen to have stairs, the key requirements to remember for stairs are: number one, all steps have to be uniform. Your max and minimum rise is between 4 and 7 inches. Treads 11 inches, so it's got to be at least an 11-inch deep stair. PROAG doesn't want open risers. Main reason for that is so you don't get your foot stuck underneath and trip. There's a whole chart on nosings, so if you're passionate about nosings on stairs, they got a chart for you. And again, the leading edge of each step tread and top landing shall be marked with a stripe. That's one of the big changes from the new PROAG, is they want that stripe on your stairs. Handrails. Handrails are required at both ramps and stairs. You do not need handrails at curb ramps. Because as we've said 100 times today, a curb ramp is not a ramp. But if you do put in a ramp or stairs, handrails are required. They have to be on both sides. You can't just have a handrail on one side of your stair. Continuous within the full length. Height-wise, 34 to 38 inches is the magic number on that. And then also 1.5 inch sort of gripping surface. So every once in a while, someone will try to put in a really fancy handrail that's like 6 inches wide. It's not actually grabbable. So again, what PROAG is all about is functionality. PROAG is not here for beauty. PROAG is not here for design aesthetics. It is here to allow people to get where they have the rights to go. So 1.5 inch clearance between handrail and adjacent surface. You got to be able to grab that handrail is kind of the easiest way to think about that. Bottom of the gripping surface not obstructed more than 20% of the length. So, oh, question. You can, yeah, so at that point you would mount the handrail to the wall. And the big thing there is to make sure you have that 1.5 inch surface between the outside face of the handrail and the face of the wall so that someone can truly get their hand around that handrail. Bottom of the gripping surface not obstructed more than 20% of the length. So sometimes you'll see these handrails with all these slats. If someone's holding onto the handrail, but they got to let go of it every 2 inches for a slat, then that's not really providing that stability that we're looking for. Cross section between 1.5 and 2 inches. Handrail extensions. If you look at the way handrail extensions read for the IDC, for the 2010 ADA standards, everything, handrail extensions are always 12 inches minimum past the stair. There is an acknowledgement in Prowag that the handrail extension shall not extend into the roadway or the pedestrian circulation path. They can extend out that 4.5 inch maximum, but if your handrails are getting into the road or into the pedestrian circulation path, there's an exception for that 12-inch minimum extension for the handrails. If you can provide 12 inches, absolutely provide the 12 inches. But what we don't want is for that handrail extension to become a protruding object. And that's what we end up with if that extends 12 inches into the pathway, is that that handrail is not going to be 27 inches to the ground, because it's got to be between 34 and 38 inches tall. So now all of a sudden, again, this is about how we can't lessen access. One thing we do can't take away access from something else. So by putting in the handrail, we have now created a protruding object problem. So that's why there's that 4.5 inch maximum extension for handrails is allowed. Any questions on that? Fantastic. Very last thing to cover today, stop signs, any other signs? Stop signs are easy, warning signs are easy. Any sign that falls under the MUTCD is easy. What I'm here to talk about today is your city signs, your wayfinding signs, anything that you might put up in your public right of way that's outside of sort of the standard WR signs. And Prowag does have specific requirements for all those signs. So if you are going to put those signs in your public right of way, R410 and R411 provides information on fonts that are allowable, heights of the words, heights of the letters, capitalized, uncapitalized, contrast. Really the main things to remember are contrast is always important. So maintain your contrast. It can be upper or lowercase. Characters shall not be italic, oblique, script, highly decorative. Again, this is about comprehending the sign. So we want clear, straightforward messaging for these signs in a font that is very easy to read. See R10 for a detailed breakdown of characters. Again, there's allowable characters and unallowable characters. Just know that Prowag does cover signs. Lastly, Prowag is also very specific on this. There is only one allowable standard for accessibility per Prowag. A lot of states have started this push towards the athletic person in a wheelchair. And Prowag specifically states that they want only the international standard of accessibility to be used. So if there is ever a conversation, a push of, oh, I heard there's a new wheelchair sign that exists, can we use that? Prowag is very clear on the fact that they want that one standard of accessibility used, and they're not looking for anything else. So that is all I got on Prowag. Does anybody have any questions before we sort of round this all up? So we got 4 total questions that were submitted. I just want to go over those and make sure that we answered those questions since you guys did submit in advance. How does Prowag apply to private path networks interfacing with a public street and right of way? Sort of the clear answer on that is if it's off a public right of way, that's 2010 standards. If it's on public right of way, that falls under Prowag. But if, for example, you have like a private coach walk that goes through the green space, that does not have to meet Prowag. That is a private walkway for that house. Now, if you use that private walkway as access from a accessible parking space, all of a sudden that's no longer a private walkway. But if it's something where it's just servicing that one house, that does not have to meet Prowag standards because that's not your pedestrian access route and that's not your pedestrian circulation route. Please review any updates to requirements. I feel fairly confident that we did that, but does everybody feel good on that one? Other submitted questions. What do you do when you have a door entrance on the corner of the block that doesn't allow for accessibility under current guidelines? It's a good question. I think the ramp is always an option if you have the space to do it, in which you can provide the ramp up to the door and then provide the accessible route around it. Also, is there another entrance that is a possible option? And then sometimes at the end of the day, it's just not going to be feasible. Maximum extent practicable, going back to that. There's times in which it's just not going to happen. Document that you did the best you possibly could and move on. How to design for accessibility when the existing roadway doesn't come close to meeting specs. I think we talked about this a fair amount as well. It's about the maximum extent practicable, document it, and if you're reconstructing everything, at that point, that's whenever you're making sure everything meets those requirements. Once you get into that full reconstruction world. But whenever your scope is just limited to touching curb ramps, you're gonna be minimized in what you can do. But do the best that you can and set yourself up for the future would be my advice on that. Resources, there's a ton out there. We mentioned it a couple times. Encourage you guys to check CMAP's website. This presentation and recording will be out there. All the other ones that we did are out there. Resources that were available at other presentations are out there. Really, the goal of this is to continue to have this be a resource for you guys moving forward. Federal standards, if you need them, we have links to the ADA, 2010 ADA standards, Prowag guidelines, all that good stuff. Illinois Accessibility Code, IDOT. If you don't already use them, Great Lakes ADA Center is a great resource. They are local, they're based out of UIC. They offer support when it comes to ADA, but they are not a reporting governmental agency. So what that means is if you call them with a challenge, they're not going to turn around and call somebody else within the government. They are specifically per the ADA. So they were actually created out of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they exist solely as a technical assistance for you guys. That is the reason they are here, is to be your guys' first phone call whenever you have questions. Access Board also has a great technical assistance line. Someone answers the phone, typically whoever answers the phone most likely had something to do with writing Prowag. So Great Lakes ADA Center, US Access Board, if you have questions, ask your questions. Again, they get questions every single day. You're not going to ask them a silly question. Ask the question, get the answers, reach out to each other for help. Goals, I feel comfortable that we hit all our goals. Future training plan for the future. So this sort of wraps up this phase of ADA training for CMAP, but that doesn't mean that CMAP is done supporting you guys when it comes to ADA. There will be additional trainings in the future. As far as this goes, they're here to support all the communities through this process. I'll also throw out there, whether Borja likes it or not, if you have a training that you think will help you, reach out to them. I'm not saying CMAP can offer it, but they're always looking for ways to help communities. So if there's something that your community needs, number one, there's a good chance other communities need it. And number two, there might be an opportunity for CMAP to facilitate those conversations. So inevitably, a month from now, you're going to have a question. Reach out to CMAP. Feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Great Lakes, reach out to Access Board. You guys have resources that exist. Please, please, please use them. And before we go, does anybody have any final questions? Okay, not seeing any. Borja, you got final announcements?
Just wanna echo, I said, please let us know what you're here, study, let us know what the challenges are. We wanna hear them because as we wrap up these run of trainings, we're putting a new one. If you need more information about accessible trails or like emergency departments or accessible engagement or like hybrid virtual meeting, let us know what your municipalities need. We will make sure to offer those trainings, the trainings that you want. So please feel free to reach out, share your concerns, your challenges. CMAP is here to help. Thank you so much for your interest in AD.
Lastly, Felicia Burton from Capital Development Board is back here again tomorrow. So if you're not signed up and you're interested, feel free to come. And with that, I think we are all good to go for the day. So thank you very much for your time. And if we don't see you tomorrow, good luck, and you can certainly do this. No, I'm fascinated to know where you guys end up on this. No, thank you.